What happened when your father-in-law started disciplining your children? I was loading groceries into the trunk when my 6-year-old son came running from my father-in-law's house with a red handprint across his face. Lucas was crying in that silent, shocked way kids do when they've been hit hard enough to forget how to breathe properly. My father-in-law stood on his porch with his arms crossed, watching us with an expression that dared me to say something. My wife was still inside helping her mother with dishes, completely unaware that her father had just slapped our child for spilling juice on the carpet. I picked Lucas up and felt him trembling against my chest, and when I looked back at the porch, my father-in-law gave me a slight nod before going inside and closing the door. That was the moment I realized Gerald didn't see my son as my son. He saw him as property that needed correction, and he'd just established that he had the authority to provide it whenever he deemed necessary. We'd moved back to my wife's hometown 3 months earlier after her mother's cancer diagnosis. The plan was temporary, just until Eleanor finished treatment and regained strength. Gerald had insisted we stay with them instead of renting, saying the house was big enough and they needed family close during this difficult time. My wife Amanda had been so relieved to be near her parents that I'd agreed despite my reservations about living under Gerald's roof. He was a retired Marine colonel who ran his household with military precision, and I'd noticed during previous visits how he treated everyone around him less as family and more as subordinates, requiring constant supervision and correction. But Amanda worshipped her father, saw his rigidity as strength and his control as love, so I'd kept my concerns to myself and focused on being supportive during her mother's illness. The drive home from Gerald's house took 12 minutes, and Lucas stayed silent the entire time, his small hand pressed against the side of his face where the handprint was already darkening into a bruise. Amanda sat in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone, mentioning something about her mother's next chemo appointment, completely oblivious to the fact that our son had been assaulted by her father 20 minutes earlier. When we got home, Lucas went straight to his room without being asked, and I heard his door close with the careful quietness of a child, trying not to draw attention. Amanda finally looked up from her phone and asked where Lucas went, her tone casual, and I told her we needed to talk about what happened at her parents' house. She set down her phone with visible irritation, already defensive before I'd explained anything. I described exactly what I'd seen, how Gerald had hit Lucas hard enough to leave a mark, how our son had come running out terrified and in pain. Amanda's expression shifted from defensive to dismissive almost immediately, and she said Lucas must have done something to deserve correction, that her father wouldn't discipline him without good reason. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I listened to her rationalize violence against our child based purely on faith in her father's judgment. When I suggested we needed to establish boundaries about who could and couldn't physically discipline our kids, Amanda said I was being dramatic, that a little discipline never hurt anyone, that her father had raised her just fine with firm boundaries and clear consequences. She went to check on Lucas, and I stood in our kitchen realizing my wife had just chosen her father's authority over our son's safety. Lucas wouldn't talk about what happened that evening, just shook his head when I asked if he was okay, and said he didn't want to discuss it. The bruise on his face had darkened to deep purple, unmistakable in shape and origin, but when I suggested taking him to the doctor to document the injury, Amanda became angry in a way I'd rarely seen. She accused me of trying to create problems where none existed, of disrespecting her father and questioning his judgment, of making a bigger deal out of normal discipline than was warranted. I pointed out that leaving bruises on a 6-year-old's face wasn't normal discipline by any reasonable standard, and she said I clearly didn't understand how children needed structure and consequences, or I wouldn't be so permissive with Lucas's behavior. The argument ended with her sleeping in the guest room, and me lying awake wondering when my wife had stopped seeing our children as people who deserved protection. The following Sunday, we were expected at Gerald and Eleanor's house for dinner, a standing weekly obligation that Amanda took seriously. I suggested maybe we should skip this week given what happened, and Amanda said absolutely not, that her mother was going through treatment and needed family support, and that I needed to get over whatever problem I'd invented about her father. Lucas begged not to go, actually begged with tears in his eyes, and Amanda told him he was being ridiculous, and that he needed to apologize to Grandpa Gerald for making such a fuss over minor discipline. I watched our 6-year-old son absorb the message that his pain didn't matter, that he owed his abuser an apology, and I felt myself breaking inside watching Amanda enforce this dynamic without recognizing what she was teaching him. At dinner, Gerald acted completely normal, asking about my work and discussing Eleanor's latest test results, while Lucas sat frozen in his chair, barely touching his food. When Eleanor asked why Lucas was so quiet, Gerald said the boy was learning about consequences, and sometimes that meant uncomfortable feelings for a while. Amanda nodded along and actually thanked her father for helping teach Lucas respect and boundaries, and I sat there in stunned silence watching my wife validate her father's violence against our child. After dinner, Gerald took Lucas aside to the study, and I started to follow, but Amanda grabbed my arm and told me to let her father have a moment with Lucas to make sure there were no hard feelings. Through the closed door, I could hear Gerald's voice, not loud but commanding, and when they emerged 10 minutes later, Lucas looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that made my throat tight. The pattern established itself quickly over the following weeks. Gerald would find reasons to correct Lucas for minor infractions that any reasonable adult would ignore or address gently. Speaking too loudly, not sitting up straight enough at the table, forgetting to say sir when addressing adults, leaving toys out in the yard. Each correction involved physical punishment, usually open-handed strikes to the face, arms, or legs, always in locations easily covered by clothing, except for that first slap that had been too visible. Amanda defended every incident, insisting her father was teaching valuable lessons about respect and discipline that I was too soft to enforce myself. When I documented the bruises with photos on my phone, she accused me of building some kind of case against her family, instead of appreciating their help during a difficult time. Our daughter, Sophie, was 4, and Gerald had largely left her alone initially, focusing his corrective attention on Lucas. But one afternoon, when I picked both kids up from Gerald's house where Amanda had left them while running errands, Sophie had finger-shaped bruises on her upper arm from where Gerald had grabbed her for running in the house. She was terrified, kept asking if she was bad, if Grandpa Gerald was mad at her forever. I held her while she cried and felt rage building in my chest that I had no acceptable outlet for. When Amanda got home and I showed her Sophie's bruises, she said her father had probably just grabbed Sophie to keep her from falling, that I was looking for problems where accidents occurred, that my obsession with criticizing her father was becoming genuinely concerning. I called a family counselor that week and made an appointment without telling Amanda, knowing she'd refuse to go if I asked first. The counselor, Dr. Nina Faulkner, listened to my description of Gerald's behavior and Amanda's responses, then asked pointed questions about the frequency and severity of physical discipline, about whether the children showed signs of fear or behavioral changes, about my wife's childhood and how she'd been raised. When I described Amanda's absolute unwillingness to question her father's methods or acknowledge harm to our children, Dr. Faulkner said the situation constituted child abuse, enabled by familial loyalty, and suggested I needed to prioritize my children's safety immediately, even if that meant conflict with my wife. She offered to see Amanda for couples counseling, but warned that adult children of authoritarian parents often struggled to recognize abuse patterns they'd normalized. I presented the counseling idea to Amanda that evening, framing it as wanting professional guidance on discipline approaches and parenting strategies during this stressful time. She agreed reluctantly, saying she'd go once to prove I was overreacting, but that she already knew what the counselor would say, that children needed structure, and her father provided exactly that. Our first session was 3 days later, and Dr. Faulkner asked Amanda to describe her childhood and her father's parenting style. Amanda spoke warmly about growing up in a structured household where rules were clear and consequences consistent, where her father's authority was absolute and unquestioned. When Dr. Faulkner gently asked about physical discipline, Amanda said of course her father had used corporal punishment when necessary, that she'd been spanked and occasionally slapped for serious infractions, and that she'd turned out perfectly fine, so clearly the methods worked. Dr. Faulkner asked Amanda if she could recall specific incidents from her childhood, and Amanda described being slapped across the face at age 8 for talking back, having her mouth washed out with soap for cursing, being made to stand in corners for hours for minor rule violations. She recounted these experiences without emotion, presenting them as normal childhood memories rather than abuse, and when Dr. Faulkner suggested these experiences might have normalized violence for her, Amanda became defensive and said modern psychology was too permissive and that society's problems stemmed from lack of discipline. The session ended with Dr. Faulkner giving us both literature about recognizing abuse patterns, and Amanda threw hers in the trash the moment we got to the car, saying she wasn't going to waste time reading propaganda about how discipline was somehow traumatic. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find Lucas locked in our basement. Amanda had left him there for 3 hours as punishment for lying about finishing his homework, a consequence she said her father had suggested when she'd called him for parenting advice. Lucas was hysterical when I found him, had wet himself from fear, and couldn't stop crying, and when I confronted Amanda about this, she said I was undermining her authority as a parent by questioning her discipline methods. I told her locking a 6-year-old in a dark basement for hours was abuse, not discipline, and she said if I really believed that, then maybe I wasn't fit to be making parenting decisions. The threat was implicit but clear. She had her father's support and her family's resources, and if I pushed too hard on this, she'd use that backing to challenge my role in our children's lives. I documented everything obsessively after that. Photos of every bruise, recordings of the children describing what Gerald had done and why, detailed notes about Amanda's responses and her father's escalating involvement in discipline decisions. I researched custody law and spoke quietly with a family attorney about my options if I needed to protect my children through legal channels. The attorney, Thomas Kowalski, listened to my situation and explained that family courts generally favored keeping children with both parents unless abuse could be definitively proven, and that my wife's complicity would complicate any custody case significantly. He suggested I consider calling Child Protective Services if I genuinely believed my children were in danger, but warned that such reports often backfired in custody situations if investigation didn't result in substantiated findings. Gerald's discipline expanded in scope and severity as weeks passed. He'd come to our house unannounced to check on the children's behavior, would override my parenting decisions openly, and had started insisting Lucas and Sophie spend weekends at his house for what he called proper supervision and structure. Amanda supported this arrangement enthusiastically, saying the kids needed more time with her parents and that Gerald's influence would correct the permissive habits I'd allowed to develop. The first weekend they stayed with Gerald, both children came home with new bruises and traumatized expressions. Lucas had been made to do push-ups until he collapsed for not addressing Gerald as Sir consistently, and Sophie had been locked in a closet for crying about missing us. When I confronted Amanda about this, she said tough discipline built character and that I needed to stop coddling children who needed to learn respect. I started refusing to send the children to Gerald's house, telling Amanda I wasn't comfortable with her father's methods and that the kids were clearly suffering. She responded by packing bags for Lucas and Sophie herself and driving them to her parents' house despite my objections, telling me I didn't get to make unilateral parenting decisions and that her father's involvement was non-negotiable. I followed her car and physically prevented her from leaving the kids there, standing in Gerald's driveway while he glared at me from his porch, and Amanda screamed that I was being controlling and unreasonable. Gerald came down from the porch and got in my face, his voice low and dangerous, saying I needed to back off and let him handle his grandchildren properly or I'd regret interfering. The threat was explicit this time, and Amanda stood beside her father presenting a united front that excluded me entirely. That night, I called Child Protective Services and filed a formal report detailing Gerald's physical abuse of my children and Amanda's enabling of that abuse. The caseworker, Jennifer Ortiz, took my report seriously and scheduled a home visit for the following week, explaining they'd need to interview the children separately and document any physical evidence of abuse. I felt sick making that call, knowing it would detonate my marriage and create permanent divisions in Amanda's family, but I couldn't watch my children suffer any longer while doing nothing. When I told Amanda about the CPS report, she looked at me with absolute hatred and said I'd just destroyed our family over lies and exaggerations, that her father was a decorated military officer whose character was above reproach, and that I'd pay for trying to destroy him with false accusations. Gerald hired an attorney immediately, a former military prosecutor named Douglas Vaughn, who specialized in defending against child abuse allegations. Vaughn contacted me directly and suggested I withdraw my CPS report before things got ugly, implying that false accusations could result in me losing custody entirely, that courts didn't look kindly on parents who weaponized abuse claims during domestic disputes. I refused to withdraw anything, and Vaughn said I'd made a serious mistake that would have severe consequences. Amanda moved out that same day, taking Lucas and Sophie to her parents' house despite my protests, and when I tried to stop her, she threatened to call the police and claim I was being violent. I watched my children leave in tears, both of them looking back at me from Gerald's car windows, and I felt completely powerless to protect them. The CPS investigation moved slowly, bureaucratically, while my children stayed with Gerald and Amanda at the house I'd reported for abuse. Jennifer Ortiz conducted interviews with Lucas and Sophie separately, but both children had clearly been coached about what to say. They denied any physical discipline beyond normal spanking, claimed they loved staying with Grandpa Gerald, and said I was the one who got angry and scary at home. The investigator photographed old bruises that were already fading, took statements from Amanda and Gerald that painted me as a disgruntled husband trying to punish his wife's family, and concluded after 3 weeks that allegations were unsubstantiated due to lack of current physical evidence and children's contradictory statements. The case was closed with no findings, exactly as my attorney had warned might happen. Amanda filed for divorce the day the CPS case closed, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting primary custody with supervised visitation for me due to my unstable behavior and false abuse allegations against her family. Her attorney was David Ramsey, a partner at the same firm where Douglas Vaughn worked, and their coordinated legal strategy was immediately obvious. They painted me as a controlling husband who'd become paranoid and vindictive, who'd made baseless accusations against a respected military veteran, and who'd traumatized his own children by forcing them into unnecessary investigations. The evidence I'd collected, all those photos and recordings, was dismissed as documentation of normal discipline taken out of context by someone with an agenda. My attorney said we'd need to fight hard, but that family courts often sided with mothers, especially when grandfathers with sterling community reputations were involved. The custody evaluation was conducted by Dr. Raymond Cross, a psychologist recommended by the court, who interviewed all parties and observed interactions with the children. Gerald presented beautifully during his interview, discussing his military service and his commitment to family values and proper child rearing, never once acknowledging that his discipline methods involved hitting young children in the face. Amanda performed equally well, presenting as a concerned mother protecting her children from an increasingly erratic father who'd made terrible accusations against her family. When Dr. Cross interviewed me, I tried explaining the pattern of abuse and the way both children had been terrorized into silence, but I could see skepticism in his expression as I described incidents that contradicted everything he'd heard from Amanda and Gerald. The children's interviews with Dr. Cross were heartbreaking to hear about secondhand. Lucas, now 7, told the evaluator he felt safest with Mommy and Grandpa Gerald, that Daddy got angry a lot and made everyone upset. Sophie, at 5, said she missed Daddy, but that Grandpa Gerald taught her important lessons about being good. Both children had been so thoroughly manipulated and frightened that they'd accepted their abuse as love and identified their protector as the threat. Dr. Cross's final report recommended primary custody to Amanda, with Gerald's household providing additional supervision and support, with my visitation limited to supervised sessions until I completed anger management counseling and demonstrated improved emotional regulation. The recommendation was based entirely on Gerald's manufactured narrative and the children's coached testimony. The custody hearing lasted 3 days and destroyed me systematically. Amanda's legal team presented character witnesses who described Gerald as a pillar of the community, including his former commanding officers, neighbors, and members of his church, who all testified to his integrity and dedication to family. They presented my CPS report as evidence of vindictive behavior and poor judgment, arguing that I'd subjected my children to traumatic investigations based on personal animosity toward my wife's father. They even produced a psychiatrist who testified that individuals who make false abuse allegations often suffer from delusional disorders or personality problems that make them unfit parents. My attorney tried countering with the photographic evidence and my testimony about specific abuse incidents, but the judge seemed skeptical, and I could feel the case slipping away. Gerald testified on the second day, sitting in the witness box in his dress uniform despite being retired, answering questions with military precision and calling everyone sir or ma'am appropriately. He described his childcare philosophy as structured and traditional, admitted to using spanking as discipline but denied ever hitting the children in anger or leaving marks, and expressed sadness that his son-in-law had misinterpreted normal grandparenting as abuse. When my attorney cross-examined him about specific incidents, Gerald remained calm and provided alternative explanations for everything, suggesting Lucas had gotten the facial bruise from rough play with neighborhood kids, that Sophie's arm bruises came from him catching her when she tripped running, that all physical evidence had innocent origins. The judge seemed to accept these explanations, nodding along as Gerald spoke. Amanda testified on the third day, crying as she described how I'd changed over the months after we'd moved back, becoming paranoid and controlling, making wild accusations that hurt her family. She said she still loved me but couldn't expose their children to my instability anymore, that Gerald had been nothing but supportive during a difficult time, and that my inability to accept normal discipline had created an impossible situation. She was convincing because she genuinely believed everything she said, had so thoroughly internalized her father's perspective that she saw his violence as love and my protection as dysfunction. When my attorney asked about specific abuse incidents I'd reported, Amanda denied them all or reframed them as misunderstandings, and I watched the judge's expression shift from neutral to sympathetic toward her position. I testified last, trying desperately to explain the pattern I'd witnessed, the systematic abuse and the children's obvious fear, the way Gerald had established dominance over our family through violence disguised as discipline. But after 3 days of testimony painting me as unstable and vindictive, my words sounded exactly as they'd been framed, paranoid accusations from a resentful husband. The judge asked why, if abuse was really occurring. The CPS investigation had found no substantiated evidence, and I had no good answer beyond explaining that the children had been coached and the bruises had faded. My testimony felt weak, even to me, undermined by the weight of everyone else's coordinated narrative. The judge thanked me for my testimony and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks. The ruling granted Amanda primary physical custody, with me receiving supervised visitation every other weekend at a court-approved facility. The judge's written decision stated that while both parents clearly loved their children, the evidence suggested I had poor judgment regarding appropriate discipline and had made serious false accusations that traumatized the family, requiring supervised contact until I could demonstrate improved stability. Gerald was specifically mentioned in the custody order as an appropriate supervisor for the children, explicitly endorsing his continued involvement in their care. My attorney said we could appeal, but that overturning custody decisions was extremely difficult, especially when evaluators and judges had found against us. I'd lost my children to the man who was abusing them, and the court system had validated his authority to continue. Supervised visitation happened in a sterile room at a family services building with a court-appointed supervisor named Margaret Vance taking notes on every interaction. Lucas and Sophie were brought by Amanda, who stayed in the waiting room while we spent our allotted 2 hours together. The children were polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable, and when I tried talking to them about anything meaningful, they gave rehearsed responses that sounded nothing like how kids actually talk. Lucas called me sir twice, copying Gerald's required formality, and when I told him he didn't need to call me that, Margaret made a note on her clipboard. Sophie asked when we were going home to Grandpa's house within 15 minutes of arriving, and when I suggested we play with the toys available in the visitation room, she said Grandpa Gerald didn't like her playing with messy toys. I spent 2 hours trying to connect with my own children while they treated me like a stranger they'd been instructed to tolerate. After the third supervised visit, I noticed new bruises on Lucas's arms, finger-shaped marks that suggested someone had grabbed him hard enough to leave impressions. When I asked him what happened, he immediately said he fell off his bike, the explanation delivered too quickly to be anything but rehearsed. I took photos and showed them to Margaret, suggesting these marks looked concerning, and she noted my concern, but said children get bruises from normal play, and that my continued focus on perceived abuse was exactly why supervision had been ordered. I called Jennifer Ortiz at CPS and reported the new bruises, and she said they'd already investigated my family once with unsubstantiated findings, that continued reports from me would be documented as potential harassment, and that I needed to work through the court system if I had ongoing concerns. I hired a private investigator named Dennis Quinn to document what was happening at Gerald's house during the times I couldn't see my children. Dennis was a former police detective who specialized in domestic cases, and he surveilled Gerald's property for 3 weeks, photographing who came and went, documenting the children's visible state when they played in the yard, recording times when he could hear shouting through open windows. His final report included photos of Lucas with visible bruising on his legs and arms, timestamp documentation of both children being forced to stand outside in the rain for extended periods as punishment, and testimony from neighbors who'd heard children crying and Gerald's booming voice issuing commands. Dennis said the evidence suggested ongoing harsh discipline that crossed into abuse, but that proving it to court standards would be difficult without access to the children or cooperation from Amanda. I filed a motion to modify custody based on Dennis's investigation and the new photographic evidence of bruising, arguing that supervised visitation should be reversed and that the children were suffering ongoing abuse under Gerald's care. David Ramsey opposed the motion viciously, calling it harassment and continued false allegations from a bitter ex-husband who couldn't accept the court's previous ruling. He moved to have my filing dismissed as frivolous and requested sanctions against me for wasting court resources with repeated baseless claims. The judge scheduled a hearing, but seemed irritated from the start, asking why I was bringing essentially the same allegations that had already been investigated and dismissed. My attorney presented Dennis's report and the new photographs, but the judge said bruises on active children were normal, and that hiring an investigator to surveil my ex-wife's family home was concerning behavior that suggested obsession rather than legitimate parenting concerns. The motion was denied, and the judge issued a warning that further filings based on similar allegations would result in sanctions and potential reduction of my already limited visitation rights. I sat in that courtroom understanding that the system had completely failed my children, that Gerald's reputation and Amanda's loyalty had created an impenetrable defense against any accountability, and that my kids would continue suffering with no protection because the court had decided I was the problem. My attorney suggested I stop filing motions and focus on maintaining the visitation I had, warning that if I pushed much harder, I'd lose even that limited contact. I went home and sat in the house that used to be full of my family and felt absolutely broken by the knowledge that I couldn't save my children from what was happening to them. Lucas started having behavioral problems at school that year, getting into fights and talking back to teachers, earning frequent disciplinary referrals that Amanda blamed entirely on my destabilizing influence. The school counselor called me once to discuss Lucas's aggressive behavior, and when I tried explaining that he was living in an abusive environment that was causing trauma-related behavioral issues, the counselor said she'd spoken with Lucas's mother and grandfather, who presented very different context about a child struggling with his parents' divorce. She suggested family counseling, and I explained we'd already tried that with my ex-wife refusing to acknowledge problems, but the counselor seemed skeptical of my version of events. Every system that should have protected Lucas was failing him because the adults in charge believed Gerald's carefully constructed image over the evidence right in front of them. Sophie began having nightmares and regressing in her development, wetting the bed and becoming clingy with Amanda in ways that suggested serious anxiety. Amanda mentioned this during one custody exchange, framing it as concern about how my visitation was affecting Sophie emotionally, suggesting the nightmares started after our supervised visits. I pointed out that bedwetting and anxiety were classic signs of trauma and abuse, and Amanda said I was projecting my own issues onto a child going through normal developmental responses to divorce. She was so deep in denial about her father's impact on the children that she'd inverted cause and effect, blaming me for symptoms that Gerald was creating. When I suggested Sophie see a therapist, Amanda said her daughter didn't need therapy. She needed stability away from a father who kept making traumatizing accusations about her family. I attended every school event I was allowed to attend, every parent-teacher conference and school play and sports activity, desperate to maintain any connection to my children's lives. Gerald showed up to many of the same events, always positioning himself as the stable grandfather figure, while I was relegated to the parent who'd created problems. Other parents clearly knew about our custody situation, and I'd overhear fragments of conversations where people discussed the divorce and the abuse allegations I'd made, usually framing me as the unstable party. Gerald had effectively poisoned the community against me through his reputation and carefully managed narrative, making it impossible for me to advocate for my children without being dismissed as the vindictive ex-husband everyone had heard about. 2 years into this nightmare, Lucas was 9 and Sophie was 7, and both children had become harder, more distant, more damaged by continued exposure to Gerald's authoritarian abuse, disguised as discipline. During one supervised visit, Lucas mentioned casually that Grandpa Gerald had made him sleep in the garage for a week as punishment for poor grades, and when I expressed alarm, Lucas defended the punishment, saying he'd deserved it for not trying hard enough in school. My 9-year-old son had been conditioned to accept sleeping in a cold garage as reasonable discipline for academic struggles, and Margaret, the supervisor, noted my emotional response as concerning overreaction to normal consequences. I filed another CPS report about the garage punishment, and Jennifer Ortiz called me back personally to say continued reports were bordering on harassment, that I needed to stop using CPS as a weapon in custody disputes, and that further unfounded reports might result in charges against me. I joined a support group for parents fighting custody battles against abusive ex-partners, and every story I heard echoed my own experience. Family courts that prioritized keeping children with mothers regardless of circumstances, abusive parents who manipulated systems expertly, protective parents labeled as vindictive or unstable for reporting genuine abuse. The group facilitator, a lawyer named Catherine Wright, who'd lost custody of her own kids years earlier, said the system was fundamentally broken when it came to recognizing abuse patterns in families where abusers maintained respectable public images. She suggested documenting everything obsessively and waiting for the inevitable moment when abusers escalated to the point where even sympathetic courts couldn't ignore it. But she also warned that by the time courts acted, children were often severely damaged, and that sometimes protective parents had to accept they'd done everything possible within a system designed to fail them. That moment of undeniable escalation came 3 months later. I received a call from the hospital emergency room saying Lucas had been admitted with a fractured arm and multiple rib contusions. Amanda claimed Lucas had fallen down the stairs at Gerald's house, but the attending physician, Dr. Yolanda Singh, had concerns about the injury pattern and had contacted CPS per mandatory reporting requirements. When I arrived at the hospital, I found Lucas sedated with his arm in a cast and visible bruising across his torso. Dr. Singh pulled me aside and said the fracture was consistent with torque injury from someone grabbing and twisting an arm with significant force, not from a fall, and that the rib bruising suggested someone had squeezed him hard enough to cause internal trauma. She'd already documented everything for the CPS investigation and had informed the caseworker that the injuries appeared non-accidental. Gerald and Amanda were in the waiting room when I came out of Lucas's room, and Gerald's expression was calculating rather than concerned, already working through how to manage this situation. Amanda was crying, but when she saw me, her grief turned immediately to defensiveness. She said Lucas had fallen, that it was a terrible accident, that Grandpa Gerald had been devastated watching it happen. I asked how a fall downstairs caused torque fractures and compression bruising, and Gerald stepped forward saying I needed to be very careful about accusations I couldn't prove, that he'd already spoken with their attorney about the situation. Even with Lucas lying in a hospital bed with injuries, doctors were calling suspicious. Gerald was more concerned with protecting himself than with his grandson's suffering. The CPS investigation this time was more thorough because Dr. Singh's mandatory report carried weight that my previous complaints hadn't. A different caseworker, Michael Torres, interviewed Lucas in the hospital once he was alert enough to speak, and initially Lucas maintained the story about falling downstairs. But Michael was experienced with abuse cases and asked specific questions about how the fall happened, what position Lucas was in, whether anyone was nearby, and Lucas's story started contradicting itself. Eventually, after gentle persistence, Lucas broke down and admitted Grandpa Gerald had grabbed his arm and squeezed his ribs for getting a bad grade on a math test, that the punishment had gone on until Lucas heard something crack in his arm, that Gerald had then coached him to say he fell because telling the truth would make everything worse. Michael Torres contacted the police immediately, and Detective Arthur Brennan from the Child Abuse Unit arrived at the hospital to take Lucas's statement formally. Lucas repeated his account on video, crying as he described the punishment and his fear of Grandpa Gerald, explaining that this wasn't the first time Gerald had hurt him, but that he'd been too scared to tell anyone because Grandpa said no one would believe him, and that Mommy would be mad if he caused problems. Detective Brennan arrested Gerald at the hospital that evening, charging him with felony child abuse and assault, causing great bodily harm. Amanda screamed that this was a mistake, that I'd somehow manipulated Lucas into lying, that her father was being persecuted, but hospital security removed her from the premises when she became hysterical. The arrest made local news within hours, because Gerald was a decorated military officer and respected community figure, and the story generated significant attention. Comment sections filled with people defending Gerald and attacking me as the vindictive ex-husband who'd finally succeeded in framing an innocent grandfather. But Dr. Singh gave a statement to media saying the injuries were definitively non-accidental and consistent with the child's disclosure, and slowly public opinion began shifting as people realized this wasn't a custody dispute but a documented abuse case with medical evidence. The newspaper published an investigation into Gerald's background and found 2 other families who'd had concerning experiences with his childcare methods but hadn't reported formally due to his intimidating presence and community standing. Child Protective Services removed Sophie from Amanda's custody immediately pending investigation, placing her in emergency foster care since I technically still only had supervised visitation rights. I filed an emergency motion for full custody of both children, and this time the judge granted it temporarily, ordering Sophie released to my care and specifying that Amanda could have no unsupervised contact with either child until completing a protective parenting program designed for parents who'd failed to protect their children from abuse. Amanda fought the order desperately, but Dr. Singh's medical report and Lucas's videotape disclosure were impossible to dispute. The judge who'd previously ruled against me now reversed course completely, acknowledging that the court had failed to recognize a pattern of abuse that had been documented in my initial reports. Gerald's trial happened 6 months later, and the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. Medical experts testified about Lucas's injuries and the impossibility of their occurring through accidental falls. Investigators presented testimony from neighbors who'd heard children crying and Gerald's authoritarian commands. Most damaging was Lucas's own testimony, delivered via video to protect him from courtroom trauma, describing years of physical punishment that escalated from slapping to squeezing to the final incident that fractured his arm. Sophie gave testimony too, describing being locked in closets and forced to stand outside in weather extremes. her small voice matter-of-fact about punishments she'd normalized as love until her father had explained otherwise. The defense attempted to paint Gerald as a dedicated grandfather, using traditional discipline methods that one incident had unfortunately escalated beyond intention. Douglas Vaughn argued that Gerald had served his country with distinction, that his military background meant he valued structure and consequences, that the arm fracture had been an accident during legitimate discipline that Gerald had immediately sought medical care for. But the prosecution presented evidence that Gerald had delayed bringing Lucas to the hospital for 6 hours, only going after Amanda had insisted, suggesting consciousness of guilt rather than accident. The jury deliberated for 3 days before convicting Gerald on all charges. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison with requirements to complete abuse intervention programs and lifetime prohibition from unsupervised contact with minors. Amanda's reaction to her father's conviction was complete psychological breakdown. She'd spent 3 decades believing Gerald's methods were love, accepting his violence as necessary correction, and internalizing lessons about discipline that had shaped her entire worldview. When forced to confront that her father was a convicted child abuser and that she'd enabled his abuse of her own children, Amanda couldn't process the cognitive dissonance. She was hospitalized briefly for psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with complex trauma from her own childhood abuse that she'd never recognized as such. Her attorney argued during continued custody proceedings that Amanda was a victim herself who needed treatment rather than punishment, and the court agreed to allow supervised visitation contingent on her completing extensive therapy focused on recognizing abuse patterns and developing protective parenting skills. The protective parenting program Amanda was court-ordered to complete forced her to examine her childhood systematically, identifying incidents she'd framed as normal discipline and recontextualizing them as abuse. Her therapist, Dr. Rachel Goldstein, specialized in adult survivors of childhood abuse who'd normalized their experiences, and she guided Amanda through the painful process of recognizing that her father's treatment of her had been violent and damaging. Amanda resisted initially, clinging to the narrative that her childhood had been fine and that she'd turned out fine, but as she processed memories through a trauma-informed lens, the defenses crumbled. She eventually acknowledged that Gerald had abused her systematically, that she'd perpetuated that abuse with her own children by enabling him, and that her loyalty to him had nearly cost her any relationship with Lucas and Sophie. It took 18 months of intensive therapy before Amanda could have unsupervised visits with the kids again, and even then, the reunification was gradual and carefully monitored. Lucas was 11 and Sophie was 9 by then, both in therapy themselves to process years of abuse and the complicated feelings about their mother's role in failing to protect them. Amanda apologized to both children formally during a therapeutic session, acknowledging specifically that she'd chosen her father over their safety, that she'd failed them completely, and that she understood if they couldn't forgive her. Lucas was still angry, struggling to reconcile the mother who'd defended his abuser with the one now crying and apologizing, but Sophie was younger and more ready to rebuild connection with the mother who was finally acknowledging reality. The custody arrangement evolved over the next year to shared custody with me having primary physical placement and Amanda having increasing parenting time as she demonstrated continued therapeutic progress. She'd cut all contact with Gerald after his conviction, refusing his calls from prison and declining to attend any parole hearings. Eleanor had divorced Gerald during his incarceration, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the abuse she'd also endured throughout their marriage, and she'd begun her own therapy to process trauma she'd minimized for decades. The family Gerald had dominated and damaged was slowly healing in his absence, each member confronting difficult truths about the violence they'd accepted as love. Lucas and Sophie both continue therapy and show remarkable resilience despite everything they endured. Lucas still struggles with anger and trust issues, responding to stress with aggression he learned from Gerald, but he's working through trauma responses with specialized counseling. Sophie has fewer behavioral issues, but carries anxiety that manifests as people-pleasing and fear of authority figures, patterns that will require years of therapeutic work to overcome. Both children understand now that what happened to them was wrong, that Grandpa Gerald hurt them intentionally, regardless of how he framed it, and that their father fought for them even when systems failed. That knowledge helps, but it doesn't erase the years they spent believing abuse was love. Amanda and I maintain a civil co-parenting relationship focused entirely on the children's needs and therapeutic progress. We'll never repair our marriage because the trust she destroyed by choosing her father over our children's safety can't be rebuilt. But she's working genuinely to repair her relationship with Lucas and Sophie, showing up consistently to their therapy sessions and learning to recognize abuse dynamics she'd been blind to her entire life. She tells them regularly that she's sorry, that she failed them when they needed protection, and that she's committed to being the mother they deserve, even though she can't undo the mother she was. Gerald remains in prison and will likely serve his full sentence. He writes letters to Amanda that she returns unopened, still attempting to justify his actions and portray himself as a misunderstood disciplinarian, persecuted by a soft generation. He'll be 74 when released, his military honors revoked, his reputation destroyed, his family estranged. The man who demanded respect through violence and control ended exactly where such men belong, isolated and powerless. My children are safe now, healing slowly from wounds that will mark them forever, learning that protection sometimes comes too late but matters anyway. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.